Okay guys, for this one here, number 147, we've got a graph, and this particular graph, it starts with a closed dot, it has a curve, and it comes down to an open dot. The graph here and the graph here are the exact same graph, but I drew them separately to emphasize the domain versus the range. So if we are going to go with the domain, we're thinking about every point that's on this curve, what's the smallest x of the coordinates on this curve through what's the biggest x for the points on this curve. So one way to do this is I put in a rectangle going from left to right. So the smallest x is -5 coming off the x-axis there. And then the largest x is 3, but it's an open dot, so not including 3. So we're gonna have a point that is 2.9999999, as many nines as we want, but we won't have a point that starts with 3. So our domain, our x's are gonna be between -5 and 3. Underline, because closed dot. No underline, because open dot. Now ultimately they would like interval notation instead. So you want to remember that when you have an underline, that goes with a bracket, and no underline is a parenthesis. So the notation here is going to be bracket, because the underline, -5 through 3, and then parenthesis. So my final answer is the interval -5 through 3. Okay, so then let's look at the range. The range is about the y's, so that's how low to how high. So the lowest point that's graphed here is at -2. Now it's open dot, so not including -2. And then the highest point that's on this graph is at a height of 5. So if we go for the range, my y coordinates are going to be -2 through 5. But if we use interval notation, no underline, so parenthesis, underline, so bracket. This is going to be -2 through 5, bracket. Okay, so looking one more time, just to recap on that. Notice domain, see how I went from how far left to how far right? Because that moves across the x-axis. And for range is how low to how high. So let's look at 2 more here. In this graph, the x-coordinates on this curve, the furthest left is -3 and the furthest right is 3. So for the domain, our x's are going to be between -3 and 3. I don't have an underline because at -3 it's an open dot. Then every point, we have all of these points of different x coordinates, but when I get to 3, that points out. So my x's are going to be between -3 and 3. Using interval notation, no underline, so parenthesis, -3 through, and then 3 parentheses. This is where I hope you guys have that moment of, isn't that a point? Go back 3, up 3, and put a dot. You have to pay attention to the context. When I see -3 through 3, yes, it could be a point, like a single point, but that's not what this means. When it's interval notation, it's saying -3 through 3, not including -3 and 3. Okay, so for range is going to be bottom to top, how low to how high. Now I know we don't see it, but is the point at the bottom of this parabola looking thing here, is this open or closed? Yeah, it's closed. because we plot a whole bunch of points and connect them. So we don't always see the closed dot that was plotted, but it is a closed dot. So the lowest that this graph goes is -5, but as I climb, I don't quite reach a height of 4 because it's an open dot. I will reach a height of 3.9999999, but not 4. So our range is going to be including -5 up through 4. Okay, so our y coordinates are going to be stuck between -5 and 4. But if I use interval notation, this is a bracket and that's a parenthesis. So I have -5 through 4. Okay, so for this last example I have, maybe you can try to think really quick of what you believe the answer should be for the domain and for the range. Okay, so the domain, maybe think about what your x's are going to be. Okay, and your thought process should be how far left to how far right. So it's going to be from the x's are between -2 and 3. We don't actually have a point at -2 or at 3, so no underlines. And turning that into interval notation, it's -2 through 3 with parentheses. And then the range there, the lowest this goes is -4 and the highest is 5. So my y's are going to be stuck between -4 and 5, not including 5, but including -4. Okay, and then using interval notation, a bracket for the less than or equal to. So -4 through 5 parentheses.